I'm with Daniel Carmon, Israel's ambassador to India from 2014 to 2018, and Navtej Sarna, India's ambassador to Israel from 2008 to 2012. And today, of course, we're discussing the big political crisis inside Israel, sometimes described as Israel's worst domestic political crisis. People have been out on the streets for the last several days. They have gone back. Several have returned after Prime Minister Bibi-Modi agreed to suspend a judicial reform that was in the making, that he was targeting, a bit like the controversy here in India over the collegium, but we will go into that later. This is a judicial reform that the Israeli Prime Minister wanted very much. It brought the people out onto the streets. Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, was even fired, and that exacerbated the political situation. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me welcome you both, gentlemen, to ThePrint. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ambassador Carmon, you are in Tel Aviv, or just outside Tel Aviv, where you live. You're a retired diplomat now. But your first comments, your analysis of this political crisis, why are people out on the streets and what are they protesting?
Well, let me start first saying that I was a very proud civil servant for 45 years, serving all the Israeli governments during all that time. Never, of course, did I express my personal political affiliation because I was serving any given government.
Absolutely.
And since I've retired, I can permit myself to be a little more free than before. And while talking to me and remembering very well with lots of pride my service to the nation during all those years, I have to tell you that as we now speak, I'm on the other side. I cannot believe myself saying so, but I'm on the other side and I'm one of the demonstrators, the many, many demonstrators in Israel against...
You were a demonstrator. You were part of the protests.
I'm part of the protests in quite a few activities, including the demonstrations. I protest a few times a week, and you've seen on TV the large quantity of people who are saying no to what the government is calling a reform. We are calling it a regime revolution. Initiated by the government. I think there is a convergence of timeline and a convergence of interests of all the factions in the government. We have a coalition government, a very fragile coalition government. Always our political system has been very, very fragile. In the past, we had two big parties now and a few small ones. But now, as we now stand, the small parties with very extreme, I would even say some fanatic demands are, let me say, blackmailing, not less than that, the government and the prime minister. We have a prime minister who is under a process, a legal process, personal, on few counts.
Yes.
We have ideologists who for 30 years have been waiting for the moment to change the regime by the way they look at it. We have some religious parties that really have unbelievable demands. And when you take all those 7 factions and each one of them can let the government fall or let the government be constructed, this timeline puts the country in a place of very quick, amok-driven legislation that started a few weeks ago with a view to terminate the legislation a few days ago. And the big fear, and that's a delicate word, of those who are against the regime revolution is that our country will change from a liberal democratic country to not such a democratic country that we're so proud of, when democracy, the basis of democracy as we know it, liberal, Jewish liberal democracy, the basis of it gave way to this country we are so proud of, which is a miracle, worldwide known miracle, I would say. When you take the democracy out of this country, it's like pulling a carpet and the whole country will change. And we are so fearful of that. And that's the essence of our protests.
Ambassador Navtej Sarna, it's interesting that a former diplomat or a retired diplomat is out on the streets protesting. You don't see that really in Delhi. You yourself are a former diplomat. But my question to you is, as also an analyst of Israel and of the world, you were also ambassador in the US. What do you make as an Indian of these protests challenging Benjamin Netanyahu's government in power?
Well, thank you, Jyoti. Thank you for having me here, and always a pleasure to dialogue with my old friend Danny here. Israel is a complex country, and it has very complex, very, very deeply nuanced issues in it. And what we are seeing today is sometimes not easy to understand for an outsider. But I think what comes through today is that Israel has been reaching this point for the last few years. Israel has been reaching this point because, frankly, there's been a failure of governance in traditional terms. Always there have been a large number of elections in Israel, and governments have changed quickly enough. But in the last 4 years, you had 5 elections.
Right.
And this is the 6th time that Benjamin Netanyahu has been sworn in as prime minister. And each time he has had to rely on, in the last few years, to rely on different parties to survive. Now, this time what has happened is that his survival is linked to, making coalition partnerships with these very far-right and religious parties who are actually very small parties in the traditional sense, but today they are wielding the power. So that is one thing. The second thing is that there has been Israel started off completely as a kind of almost a socialist country.
Right.
There was a very strong left in Israel to begin with. And then over the years, and particularly last 2 decades, you have seen a rise of the religious parties. You have seen a move to the right, totally. And that these have set in place forces which have been coming to the surface. And today, so what you see today in the terms of the protests are not protests simply against the judicial reform or whatever other name we may call it. We call it judicial reform for convenience of understanding.
Right.
But I think they are essentially protests about Israel's way of life, Israel's direction in the future. Because there are several reasons why this judicial reform can lead to deep divides. But I will stop there and let you take us in the direction you want.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is a fascinating time, I'm sure, to be in Israel, Ambassador Carmon. But the question to you is that Prime Minister Netanyahu, like Navtej just said, and you've been saying, is he a powerful prime minister? He has come back to power for the 6th time. Is he a powerful prime minister? And do you think he should go at this moment?
He's a powerful statesman. He knows his stuff. He's very, very experienced. But something happened to him in the last few years. And we don't know what happened to him, but something has happened to him and he cannot control. Sometimes we feel he cannot control his partners. I'm not sure he's the person who would go for what we call dictatorship. And part of the fear that people have here is that democracy will change into dictatorship, because part of those reforms, as they call them, and revolution as we call them, are putting the separation of powers, which is so important in any democratic regime. There would be almost no difference between government, legislator, and the judiciary. This is the end result of the ideologies who want to change the regime. And this is what we're trying to fight, because the country will change, as Navtej has said, the country will change, but the implications will be far beyond the legal implication or the structural implication.
Okay.
So to go back to your question, I can see Netanyahu continuing to be part of the system if he gains control again on his partners, not so much on his own party, but on his partners who have demands that are totally unacceptable and would put Israel in any field, security, economy, society, in a position that is unacceptable. We cannot. Navtej mentioned the socialist beginning of Israel, the founding fathers of Israel, the descendants of the founding fathers of Israel cannot accept, if I may say, this country to become a totally religious country. One of the parties that is blackmailing the prime minister, their vision is to have a totally fanatic religious country at the end game. Another one would like to annex the occupied territories, the Palestinian occupied territories, disregarding the rights of the Palestinian people, which is totally unacceptable, of course, etc., etc. So if this trend continues, he should go. If he regains control because of the fact that he won the elections, and if he can form a government without the fanatics, then so be it.
Okay. And Navtej Sarna, Ambassador Sarna, the question to you is that Bibi-Netanyahu knows India well. He's visited India. Prime Minister Modi was in Israel when he was Prime Minister last time around. What is the relationship like between these two men?
No, obviously, the relationship on a personal level, from what we have seen in the media, I have no other ways of knowing. Because all this happened after I was no longer in Israel. But yes, the relationship has been warm. It's been cooperative. But I think, while personal relationships play an important role in bilateral relations, Jyoti, as an analyst of foreign affairs, you well know that bilateral relationships are based on overall bilateral interests. Mm-hmm. And the leaders make personal relationships with whoever is in power. And I'm sure, because we have had, a good, steadily developing relationship with Israel since 1992. Right. We have set up diplomatic relations in 1992, and very gradually this relationship has now come into full bloom. So I am sure that our leadership will effectively deal with whoever is the leader in Israel through the right process. So, as always, we let the internal developments take place and bring out their own result and then deal with it.
Okay, Ambassador Carmon, the same question to you. Netanyahu and Prime Minister Modi, both prime ministers, knew each other well. When Bibi was in India, when Prime Minister Modi has been in power, and vice versa, Prime Minister Modi made a visit to Israel in 2018. Tell me a little bit about the relationship. You were an ambassador at the time.
To continue what Ambassador Sarna said, we have a saying in Hebrew: we are here for the kingdom, not for the king. The relationship, the personal relationship, is important. There is something called personal diplomacy, and we know that it is very important to Prime Minister Modi and not unimportant to Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think that the relations between India and Israel are regardless of who is in charge, but we have seen both the relationship between the kingdoms and between the leaders flourish. But I have to say, there is a history. These relations have a history. Some of it was a discrete history, but developing since 1992 with if I may say, the best Indian diplomats who could serve, and Ambassador Sarna is one of them, made it happen. It started gradually and discreetly, and it came out in public in 2014, a few months after elections in India. But it took more time until the personal diplomacy between the two leaders came into effect. The ambassador to Washington at the time, Dr. Jaishankar, was very instrumental in making the first meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Netanyahu in New York. They had a good meeting, and since then they've talked very much about the friendship, the personal friendship between themselves. But they didn't meet too much. They spoke on the phone here and there, but not. But when they came to visit each other, especially in July 2017, on the 4th of July 2017, with a very successful visit by Prime Minister Modi to Israel, which started with a speech he gave at the airport. And since it was the 4th of July, Prime Minister Modi remembered the brother of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who was killed as a commando officer in the Entebbe operation. And this point, I felt, there was no ice, but this point broke any distance, if at all, and started a really very strong personal friendship, which was parallel to the friendship between the countries. So there are two which converge into one, and I think that the personal one is important.
So I know you said, Ambassador Sarna, that the personal and the professional must be kept apart. But in this particular case, as Ambassador Carmon has pointed out, there is a personal friendship between Bibi-Netanyahu and Prime Minister Modi. So now that these protests are taking place against Netanyahu, what do you think is going on in the minds of the people in Delhi and perhaps in Prime Minister Modi's mind as well?
Well, I have no way of guessing what is going on in the Prime Minister's mind, but I can tell you what, as a Foreign Office diplomat, what one would be thinking was that watch what's happening and keep an eye, keep the India-Israel relationship boat steady. Carry on the processes which are already in play. Let them figure out what's going to happen inside Israel. Let them figure out what's going to be the new government, or is the same government going to continue, and within what parameters. But we have been in unsteady situations before. I mean, I was the ambassador when Donald Trump came into the US, and everybody was wondering, where are we going? So the entire focus of ours was keep the relationship steady, let it settle down, let us see what happens. So in every situation, as a country goes into crisis, the important partners wait and watch and make sure that they keep their oars in and they wait for the right moment to move on.
Well, Donald Trump himself has been indicted on criminal charges, as you know, and he and Prime Minister Modi also seem to have a very good relationship. When Prime Minister Modi went to the US and said, "Is ab ki baar Trump sarkar?" But be that as it may, the question to you, Ambassador Carmon, is that Bibi Netanyahu today he's and by the way, just to explain to our viewers, and to reiterate, that this question of judicial reform that the protesters are protesting, and Netanyahu wanted or continues to want control over the judiciary in Israel. And that is really significant because the judiciary very often comes in the way of the elected politician and prevents him from doing what he wants to do. But the question to you, Ambassador Carmon, is that under Bibi Netanyahu's prime ministership the previous time around, as you said before, the relationship between India and Israel grows from strength to strength. But we did have, including especially the defense relationship. But my question is about Pegasus. Now, India's agencies, including its intelligence agencies, during Netanyahu's government, did buy this software from the Israeli company. What do you make of that?
I frankly don't see any relations between one and the other. I mean,
well, the relationship is the question is that Pegasus has been used to investigate private citizens in India, and this is an Israeli company that sold its software to India's intelligence agencies, who are now investigating civilians or Indian citizens that for things that they may or may not have done.
I understand, but I frankly don't see any relations between the relationship between the states and the countries and the government and a commercial company, successful as it might be, and it is it was successful, selling anything to any customer worldwide. If there is a problem within Israel, then they would be alerted in Israel, because there is a system of exports of any kind of system, defense system or other systems. There is a very well integrated system within Israel, but once companies are allowed to sell abroad, they sell abroad. Whatever is done by the customer, I
don't think Netanyahu would have eased the way or paved the way for this sale to India?
I don't know, but this does not mean that the relationship, especially on the defense side, is a very, very strong one. Mm-hmm. And this brings me, not only defense, but this brings me to a conclusion. You in response to what you asked Ambassador Sarna, I don't see any danger to those relations whatsoever. And by the way, I was asked in 2015, before the elections in Israel, will anything change from the Israeli perspective towards India? I said a big no then, and I say a huge no now. The relationship are very much based on very strong pillars. And by the way, any political change in India, from my perspective, would change marginally, maybe. But we have come to such a strong relations. I don't see them changing in any way because of the interests and because of other elements that are beyond the interest between those two countries, which is remarkable. 40, 50 years ago, you would not believe that the relations would get to the point in which they are now.
Ambassador Sarna, would you agree with that assessment, which is that whether it's a Congress government in India or whether it's a BJP government in India, relations between India and Israel are only getting stronger?
Well, yes, they're only getting stronger. There's always when a party changes, particularly in India and in particular relationships, you do see a difference of nuance. Mm-hmm. And you did see a difference of nuance in the last few years, which we have already talked about. But I think the fundamental relationship, the direction of the relationship, the strategic logic of the relationship, stands on its own and moves. And then there are, nuances, tone, personal meetings, all these change. For instance, we did not have 20 years ago, 15 years ago, we did not have so many high-level visits from both sides. Mm-hmm. The relationship was developing, but yes, you did not have so many bilateral summits, etc., as you have seen in the last few years. So that's a change of nuance. That's a change of coming. It's also a reflection of what's happening in the region, particularly in West Asia. We no longer have to make choices that are we going to be talking to the Saudis or are we going to be talking to UAE, or can we sort of go with Israel? 20 years ago, you had to think, what's going to be the impact on our relations with the Arab world if we are seen to be causing up too much to Israel? So while we developed our relationship, we did it discreetly. But today, a lot of things have changed in the region. So yes, that's a long answer to your question.
But Ambassador Carmon, Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, the well-known columnist, has said that Israel is in danger under Netanyahu of becoming an elected autocracy. And he mentions countries like Hungary and a couple of others. What do you think?
When our worst nightmares are to get and to be like Hungary and Poland. It started slowly. It started gradually. The people were put to into some kind of coma or sleep, and they thought they understood what was going on, but they didn't. And within a few years, those democratic countries, by the way, members of the European Union, which is interesting, a European Union which is so puts liberal democracy on the top of the agenda. Two countries, members of the European Union, have become, as I said before, on the fear that we have of erasing the difference between erasing the separation of powers. This is the worst example of what could happen, and this is the reason for us protesting. We will not accept any amok-driven legislation and changes. And by the way, there are changes already in effect in the management of the Palestinian territories by the Israeli presence in the occupied territories, which could bring Israel to a situation which we do not want to get there. And it's not legislation, it's not the regime, it's Israel's relation with the rest of the world, with the international community. Those are dangers that at the end of the day would put us and our economy and our, I would say even our existence as a free, democratic, liberal Western country into danger.
Ambassador Sarna, the parallels are very close. I mean, I know you're denying the personal and the professional, the linkages between the two.
No, I did not deny the personal. I said it's part of an overall setup. Yeah.
Okay, let me rephrase that it's part of the personal is part of the overall diplomatic or professional setup. But the parallels are quite incredible. Here in Israel, you have the people protesting the so-called judicial reform that Netanyahu wants to implement. In India, the government, Modi's government, wants to also overhaul the collegium system, which is control over the judiciary. Now, that has been put in abeyance for a while, but you don't really see people coming out in the streets. So perhaps India should take a lesson from Israel, or leaf out of Israel's book.
Well, Jyoti, I think it would be facile to come to these conclusions. These are very different situations. And firstly, let me tell you that this so-called overall judicial reform in Israel is not simply about appointment of judges. I mean, that is one aspect. The fact is, for instance, there are other aspects. For instance, they see the activism of the court, for instance, in favor, against the ultra-Orthodox community. If you have religious parties in power, as you have today in the coalition in Israel, they want to support the Orthodox. Now, the Orthodox form 10 to 11% of Israel's population, and they do not work. Don't want to go to military service, and there is a lot of opposition within it. Now, do they want to open the doors to that sort of thing? They want to revise the law of return. The law of return in Israel.
Political parties want to revise the law of return.
Yes, that if you have one grandparent who is Jewish, then you can be Jewish for performing Aliyah or coming to Israel to settle down. If they restrict that law of return, then all the Jews who are coming from the erstwhile Soviet Union countries will be impacted, as perhaps
surely the judiciary in Israel is therefore to be complimented for taking the positions it has.
No, so yes, they have a certain point of view, and what you need is a kind of balance between what the government wants, what the judicial authorities can see as being reasonable and good for Israel, and a balance. But under these so-called reform, the judiciary will become completely subservient to the legislature. And in Israel, being subservient to legislature means you're subservient to executive. Mm-hmm. Because, it is a unicameral system. Right. There is only one house in the Knesset. There is no written constitution, unlike other countries, including India. There is no written constitution. So, that these are very fundamental differences and certain peculiarities of the situation in Israel. I'm not even going into the specialities and peculiarities of a Jewish society, and the issues of a possible two-state or lack of two-state, the issue of settlements, the issue of minority rights. Israeli Arabs form 20% of Israel's population. So there are a host of issues. Firstly, it would be facile to see what's happening in Israel as only about selection of judges.
Okay, so you're not answering the comparison or the...
No, I say because a comparison is not a comparison would be wrong and unfair to everybody concerned, because we have a huge country. We have 1.4 billion people to Israel's 9.5 million people. Mm-hmm. You have a federation, you have a written constitution, you have a very well developed system of parliament as well as judiciary.
No,
and obviously, a very clear distinction between the legislature and the executive.
No, obviously, Ambassador Sarna.
I know journalistically it would be nice and cute to come to that conclusion, but as a diplomat, I'm sorry I can't assist you.
Okay, obviously there are huge differences. Nobody's comparing Israel and India, like you said, 1.4 billion versus 9 million people. But we are both democracies, and the fact that Israeli civil society diplomats like Ambassador Carmon are out in the streets protesting the alleged changes in the nature of Israeli society and government. I mean, that's quite interesting. So the last question to you, Ambassador Carmon, is what are people now saying about the Palestinian cause, or is that story a dead one? Over the decades, there has been so much protest. Again, not long ago when Bibi-Netanyahu was prime minister, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of conflict on the streets between the Israeli government and the Palestinians. What are they saying now? What are the people saying?
I do not want to put the coins exactly on the protest for reforms or against reforms in response to this question, but I must add to what Ambassador Sarna said. Any point that he mentioned as examples of friction is influenced by those reforms. Everything will be influenced, and that's a disaster that we might be facing.
Yes.
On the Palestinian issue, there is not an identity of opinions, because the protests that we are talking about transcends political parties. It's not right or left. It's a way of life against another way of life. Totally different. On the Palestinian issue, there always has been a division between those who say that a Palestinian state should be established at one point or another when fitting, when it'd be suitable to do it after negotiations, after we overcome terrorism, after there is a responsible government on the Palestinian side, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Some of Netanyahu's partners even say that Israel should annex the Palestinian territories, and there would be one big Israel, and they are in the government. Those fanatic guys are in the government, and one big Israel is a demographic disaster for the Jewish state of Israel. So we have this discussion.
Sounds, Ambassador Carmon, it sounds like this Akhand Israel that you're talking about. Just like in India, a lot of people talk about this Akhand Bharat, especially the RSS. But I think I'm going to leave it there. And thank you both so much for your time, Ambassador Carmon from Tel Aviv in Israel, explaining this very complex situation of why people are protesting on the streets against the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and Ambassador Navtej Sarna right here in New Delhi. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.